This is my review for the Mardi Gras Massacre. Or, I guess technically Mardi Gras Massacre. But anyway. So, the Mardi Gras Massacre is a film that was recorded in 1978, but for reasons unknown, I couldn't find anything on this. It wasn't released until 5 years later in 1983. So, we see, I. I never knew that this was a thing that would happen because this also happened with Don't Go Near the Park and another movie I can't remember, not Driller Killer. There was another movie I also watched where something similar happened where, a movie is recorded and then not released until years later. I don't know why some people do that, but this is one of the movies that did that. So for whatever reason, this movie was not released until 5 years after it was made, which I don't even remember if I don't think I wrote that down, but I think that is sort of a tragedy in a way because there was a lot of stuff when this movie came out that would have been relevant for the 70s and not so much in the 80s. Now, I wasn't even born in the 80s, so I don't know how. Maybe somebody else could let me know what they think about this. But I feel like by the time this movie came out in 1983, there was a lot of stuff that wasn't relevant, such as the fashion and the music. But anyway, to the actual review that I wrote, I tried to find whatever I could about the movie after I watched it, but information is scant. Just kind of like I was talking about. It wasn't released till 5 years later, but there's no reason why. So, in fact, when I tried looking up anything on the newspaper archive, which was last night before I recorded this, February 16th, 2026. Anyway, yesterday when I tried to find anything in the newspaper archives, I couldn't find anything other than just a couple of listings of like, oh, it's at this theater or that theater. And when I tried to go more than a couple of pages, the website itself kept messing up last night. And I don't know why. I couldn't see anything past a couple of pages, and I guess it's just supposed to remain a mystery that I'm not supposed to find out. That said, I didn't see any reviews for the movie when it was released in 83 or anything in 1984. It's, I guess, just that underground. And for reference, I also watched this one on Fossum. So the start of the film threw me off at first, as the opening credits have no sound at all for whatever reason. The same is true for the end credits, which I found was an odd choice, considering that the film has a fantastic soundtrack. The movie starts in a bar where we see two women talking to each other. They come up to the actual bar itself, and there's a man who is named Sam. And Sam, I assume, is the owner of the bar or whatever. Sam seems to be the overseer of the women, right? And if you want to call it that, Sam seems to have a lot of women that know him. Sam knows a lot of women. And in the bar, we see a strange yet proper gentleman who asks for the most evil woman in the bar. It's implied from the start that the movie deals with some underworld type of things, the main theme being around prostitution and, of course, murder. So the proper gentleman, who I don't remember his name actually being formally announced, but apparently, according to Wikipedia, the murderer's name is John, which I found ironic because this deals with prostitution, and then you have Johns and yada yada. Anyway, so the proper gentleman makes acquaintance with the most evil of all the escorts, and they go back to his apartment. Before doing so, he pays the woman, whose name was Shirley, and she gives the cash to Sam to hold. When they get to the apartment, the proper gentleman ties up the woman, Shirley, and starts oiling her body. And the way the scene looked, it seemed clear to me that it was inspired by Anton LaVey in some way. Yes. With the way the room looked, it was like a literal ritual chamber. Once again, it's obviously these people must have watched Satanists and was oh, I'm going to do that, but make a horror film, right? The woman, or women actually, the women would end up being put on the altar naked, and then the ritual would be performed. The biggest difference here in the movie is that the women were literally sacrificed, murdered, and where in real life the Church of Satan never condoned anything like that. It seems that a lot of horror films were inspired by the Church of Satan, the Satanic Bible, and Anton LaVey, though a lot of these movies, especially from the 70s, never flat out admit this. Of course, movies that come to mind that were so obviously influenced by the Church of Satan is Satan's Children, in my opinion. The murderer, like I said, who isn't like formally named, or if he was, it is so done in passing, I do not remember. But anyway, he reminded me of Jack the Ripper in a sense, where he would pay for an escort services and end up killing them in the end. There are multiple instances of prostitutes being murdered in history due to men's preconceived notions on how a woman should act. That said, the exact reason why the prostitutes are targeted isn't known. The murder is never really fleshed out in that way. The most that we, the viewer, get is that the murders happen as part of a sacrifice to an Aztec god. When the murderer kills his victims, he takes out their hearts and puts it on the altar in the back of the room. Beyond that, we don't see what happens next. What does he gain when he places their hearts on the altar? Is that how he gets money? This is never addressed. Even still, I found the movie to be incredibly entertaining and pretty funny at times. I loved how the movie was actually filmed in New Orleans and had actors from Louisiana in it. There were some characters played by people wearing Saints jerseys and had distinct Louisiana accents and were just very Southern overall. Even though I personally live in Texas, I always appreciate just anything that is Southern and done right. There weren't like phonies trying to emulate Cajun accents, and it seemed very authentic. I could tell that the people making the film had a great time. It seemed like they had a lot of fun, and many of the extras just seemed happy to be there. So, after the murder of Shirley, Sergeant Frank Herbert is put on the case with his partner. In trying to gain information about the case, Frank talks to Sam, the barkeep/owner from the opening part of the film. Sam gives Frank the money that Shirley was paid from the murderer, and Frank just pockets the money. This, of course, isn't brought up until later. And Frank then talks to another escort whose name is Sherry, who saw Shirley with the murderer the night before. The names were pretty confusing, and I wish they thought up different names for the characters, because Sherry and Shirley is too close. Come on. So Frank ends up taking Sherry out to dinner, and they quickly fall for each other. The two sleep together and start a romance, and the couple fall into the trope of a guy falling in love with a hooker and the whole woman with a no-no job. So Frank shows that he's the type of guy that would love to sleep with prostitutes, but would never seriously date one because of her job. This is something that I've actually heard about in real life with porn stars, and at this point, people that do OnlyFans. There's a lot, I've just heard about this a lot, where people will get into fetish content. Women will get into fetish content. They get a lot of viewers or admirers, and then basically they're not taken as serious romantic partners. But back to the review. So, ironically, when Frank tells his friends about Sherry, they actually say that she is too good for him. So all of his friends already knew that he was a dirty cop, and the movie develops the love plot line for a bit, which I didn't understand at first. I was like, why are they talking about this love story? There's a killer on the loose. Come on, man. But it does end up coming together in the end, sort of. But basically, Frank and Sherry seem to have a real love, but he can't get over her profession as a prostitute. So eventually the two break up, especially once Sherry finds out that Frank pocketed the money that Shirley made before being killed. Which I found was interesting because Sherry said that everyone had to pitch in just to bury Shirley, and they could have at least used the money to give her a proper burial. So in between like the scenes with the love plot line, we do see the murderer and he kills two more women. I found it interesting that he used the fact that they were prostitutes against them, which is, of course, something that happened in real life. And yes, this is the point and plot of the movie, but the way it was written was actually quite clever to me. In all instances, he would talk to someone at the bar looking for the most evil woman. He wouldn't prey on a woman. His victims would be brought to him. And that's because of the whole prostitution thing. So what was sad to me was how the last victim was a 19-year-old girl who was told by her pimp that she didn't have to sleep with men anymore. But her pimp tells her that she had to do it this time because she owed him money. So you really see how money and sex were held against these women and how easy it was for the murderer to kill them. They were easy victims because they were thought of as throwaways or evil by the killer himself. Once again, things that actual murderers in real life have done and thought of and, shown themselves to think. Obviously, not... when this movie was filmed, this was before John Wayne Gacy was caught, but somebody that I thought of as, an example of this was Gacy, because Gacy killed people that were thought of as like runaways or throwaways. Initially people were afraid to go to the police because it's like, oh my God, the police will think I'm gay. So that's kind of I just thought that was a very interesting point with how this movie was written, because that happens in real life. That's my point with that. So I do wonder if the idea that the murderer was killing women who were evil because to him using sex to make money was evil, right? So in each ritual killing, the murderer stabs the women's hands and then he cuts their foot. He cuts the hand because it took the money that he gave them for sex, and he cuts the foot because they walked to his apartment to do the deed with him. So I found this an interesting concept because it was like a punishment for sex. Once again, like Jack the Ripper. And I do wonder, just off the top of my head, if the writers to this movie were into reading about stuff like that, historical true crime, With all of the women that he kills, he throws the bodies on the railroad tracks, which are found like the day after. He wasn't even trying to hide the bodies. And that's not something that's ever really brought up, but I guess for the sake of the film, he wasn't obviously supposed to be caught that way. What's interesting to me is that with the last victim, he actually almost doesn't kill her, the 19-year-old. He asked her how old she was, and when she told him her age, he was like visibly shocked, like, oh, she's too young. And you could see that he starts to have remorse about how young she was. Like, for a split second, he had second thoughts about what he was doing, and it was like, she's not even old enough to be evil. You know what I mean? That's the way I took it. But he actually asks her to leave, but she doesn't because of how much he paid. So I guess because she was like willing to still get the money, he's like, well, you're still evil anyway, so I'm going to kill you anyway, because I guess the whole concept of money being the root of all evil, blah, blah, blah. I did wonder if the murderer had second thoughts. Maybe he thought for a minute that the women weren't evil for the jobs they were doing. At least some of the women, kind of like this 19-year-old, were just selling their bodies because they had no other choice or they knew nothing else. I think it was implied that the 19-year-old grew up very, very poor, and so she had no other plan, no other choice but to go into prostitution. But I know I'm kind of like thinking too hard into this. I just, once you know a little bit like about this type of subject and true crime and even just shit like Jack the Ripper, movies like this make you see things in a different way. Or you see things like this movie in a different way. Anyway. So, after this third murder, it's revealed that Mardi Gras is approaching, and the police try to crack down and solve the murder, afraid that more killings would happen with the celebration. So, Frank and his partner are then seen in a montage going to different shops trying to find the guy, and only by chance they end up getting his address when they just so happen to go to the Chinese restaurant that the killer ordered food from. And I didn't write this earlier, but before he killed the third victim, the murderer ordered Chinese food for the third girl. And so when he ordered the Chinese food, it was delivered to the apartment. The delivery boy remembered the address because the killer ended up giving him a pretty big tip. At least what was, I'm sure, a big tip for 1978. I don't feel like looking this up, but I remember that it was $10, which minimum wage in the 70s was like $5. So that was like, I don't know, like 20 some dollars. You're getting twice minimum wage for a fucking tip. So anyway, he remembered the address. So anyway, the killer is then seen trying to set up three women to sacrifice, one of these women being Sherry, because remember, Sherry's a prostitute. So the three women are drugged, then tied up, but they're saved in the nick of time by Frank. The killer runs away and they go on this wild goose chase, a car chase. And the police, of course, the fucking cops, they lose them. And they lose the killer, who supposedly drives this car that he stole into the river, but it's noted by one of the cops that no one was in the car. So later, the car is pulled out of the water and there's no body. The only thing remaining is the mask that the killer wore before his ritual killings. After this, the movie ends and the credits play. And for whatever reason, there's no music at the end of the movie with the credits. There's no music with the opening credits or the end credits, which I don't understand. That said, I really enjoyed this movie, believe it or not. Looking it up later on, like other people's reviews or even just small mentions on social media, a lot of people consider this to be a bad movie, but one thing that has united anybody that has watched this movie is the soundtrack. The best part to me is absolutely the soundtrack. The movie is, even though there's no music in the opening and end credits, the music in the movie itself is really good. It wasn't made for the movie. Somehow, I don't know how this happened, but the creators to the film were able to license some songs from Westbound Records. And it says that in the credits. Now, it doesn't say who made the music. It just says the music came from Westbound Records. And I don't know how they had those connections, but I am glad. The actual artists aren't mentioned, but in the decades since the movie was released, other people have noticed how good the music was, and they wondered, who made this? Who made the music to this? So I looked this up, and thankfully because of the internet, other people have, tried to find this out. And the track listing I did find on a blog called Temple of Schlock. So thank you, Temple of Schlock, for posting that, where basically the entire soundtrack is almost entirely music made by Dennis Coffey and the Mike Theodore Orchestra. One song, which is from the montage, is by CJ and Co. So thankfully, all the songs can be found on YouTube, but there's no official digital release to the Mike Theodore and Dennis Coffey songs. Those are just okay, you find it on YouTube, that's pretty much as far as it goes, But the songs are mostly from the album Cosmic Wind by the Mike Theodore Orchestra and Back Home by Dennis Coffey. When this film was originally made in 1978, those were very new releases. Both albums I just mentioned were released in 1977 and I think early 78. So at the time, this movie was hip and new and fresh. So I don't understand why it wasn't released until 5 years later, So the one song by CJ and Co. is, like I said, what is used in the montage scene. And all of the musicians, include, CJ, Mike, and Dennis, all these musicians seem to have had ties or were from Detroit. I'm not sure if the creators to the film might have had friends from the area, but it was very interesting to note. I don't know what the Detroit, Michigan, and New Orleans, Louisiana connection was, but hey, that's how we got the music. So, what I really like is how the soundtrack is very funky. It's, yes, it's disco, but it has this very, very big funk sound to it. I actually surprisingly really love funk, stuff like Rick James, and that's the kind of thing. Like, if you like Rick James, you would like this soundtrack, I really think. Another band I think a person would enjoy is Caldera and their album Sky Islands, which I think is very much in the same note of this soundtrack. So, on top of that, if you enjoy more music like this, funk, 70s kind of disco-esque, not exactly disco, not like Bee Gees, but this kind of note, something like the Rick James type of stuff, I think you should really check out the YouTube channel called Terminal Passage, who has a lot of amazing underground music, and they're actually one of my favorite channels. That channel is how I have come across a lot of underground music. So I really recommend Terminal Passage. Anyway, so I love music, and I especially love a movie that has a great soundtrack. Other movies that I enjoy, the soundtracks too. Other movies that I feel like the soundtrack makes the movie even better are Taxi Driver, Day of the Dead, and of course Dawn of the Dead. Those movies I just mentioned, I actually have digital versions of the soundtracks, and I just listen to when I'm just like trying to focus or hang out or just whatever. Like, I legitimately love the soundtrack to those movies. So I think it's one thing to have a good movie, but a good soundtrack can turn that good movie into a great one. Without the music, this movie, the Mardi Gras Massacre, would be only like 3 stars at the most. But for me, surprisingly, I would give this movie 4 stars. Seriously, I just love the music to this movie that much. I think it's that good. Maybe I'm just crazy. But another interesting point about the movie is how there was definitely some sort of research put into this. Obviously, having it set in New Orleans, there would be some element of magic to it. But surprisingly, it doesn't talk about voodoo, hoodoo, or witchcraft. What's interesting is how the killer is in New Orleans, yet practice some sort of Aztec ritual. When the cops are talking to a college professor in another scene, they seem to cite actual information about this, like they actually looked up some of the things about the culture. Now, of course, this is turned into a horror movie, so it's probably not that flattering, but hey, I give them credit for doing actual research. What also caught me by surprise was how there was another scene that brought up the Manson murders. Yes, they actually called it out by name. The police in the movie state that the Manson family committed ritual killings. Satanic ritual killings. I found this massively interesting, especially since the movie, like I said, was recorded in 1978. Or 77, 77, 78 is when this movie was originally made. And so at the time it was made, Tate LaBianca hadn't even been a decade old yet. The deaths of Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate weren't even a decade old yet. Once again, we see how these actual murders influenced film, even though many people don't seem to outwardly admit it. I thought I was crazy when I was watching some of these other movies from the 70s, and I was like, this kind of like reminds me of Manson shit. This seems like Manson vibes. Some of the stuff with Satan's children, and even the clown murders. I was like, are they hinting at the Manson family? And I thought I was going crazy. Like, am I just Manson-minded? No. This seems to have been a thing in the 70s, but no one would actually admit it. So, unfortunately, in many ways, Sharon Tate's death really influenced and changed film forever. Not that it was ever like an understatement, but her death changed film in ways that I don't think she could have ever comprehended. What I find interesting about this part of the movie is that we see this is obviously an example of how there were many people in the public that still thought, or at least remembered, how the Tate LaBianca killings were originally depicted as satanic ritual killings. It seems so far removed today in 2026, but it is true that the news did report these deaths as ritual killings. And obviously, I'll put some articles on the screen here. Granted, I don't think that Tex Watson or Patricia Krenwinkel would ever admit to being a ritual killer. Once again, I do enjoy this movie. I really actually surprisingly enjoyed this. I liked it. I liked it a lot. And even though it's like, a cult film, kind of cheesy in ways, I actually recommend this. I do. If anything, even if the acting is like so bad you hate it, at least watch it long enough to listen to the soundtrack. I want to know what other people think. So it might not seem great to people who don't know. I admit, if you don't know anything about like New Orleans, Louisiana, just Southern culture in general, or even anything about witchcraft or magical things, you might not like this film. You might not understand it. And so I understand that in this way, this movie is for a niche audience, but for the niche audience that it caters to, I find this to be great. So once again, I give this 4 out of 5 stars. Is that even on the camera? 4. So 4 out of 5 stars. I really love this movie. And you can watch it right now as I record this on Fossum. So hopefully in the future, this will still be available for people to watch. I really think people should watch this. I really do. It's just so silly in many ways. But like unintended, you're like, this is so silly. But I'm like interested. Huh. So anyway, watch it. Watch it. Watch it. All right, I need to end this video. Thank you for watching. Bye.